most of the folks who grew up in St. George or in the Utah's Dixie area in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s have stories to tell about the movies and about movie stars coming to town.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
I'm in the studio today visiting with our producer, Ricky Valadez, and I'm giving him a little bit of a primer or a history of movie filming in the St. George area. And Ricky's from a much more recent generation than I am. And a lot of these stories are from generations before me. But what's interesting about what I want to share today is that there's been this amazing history of movie filming in this area. And it's something that I look back at and think of fondly. But right now, as we speak, the movie filming business in the St. George area is burgeoning again, and there's a renaissance of it that is amazing. And so the disclaimer I want to share here is that the stories of now and the future we're going to save for another episode. I know that there's such great work being done in the area. Kevin Costner has discovered this area through the great work of Greater Zion and Joyce Kelly and the amazing work that she's done there. And Kevin Costner and his group have already begun construction of a sound and film studio here with the Burgess family. And there's all these great things going on. But today, we're going to look back, kind of that golden era, and look at how that really actually harkens forward to what we're experiencing today. When I was 13, I think it was right around 1968 is when Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was filmed in this area. And that was an amazing experience for all of us who lived here at that time, especially a 13-year-old kid. Not that we knew it was going on at the time, but once that movie came out and we saw the landscapes and we saw the amazing treatment of our backyard in that film, it really sparked something in our hearts and something we were very proud of. And I remember as a teenager in my room in my house, I had a poster of Paul Newman and Robert Redford coming out of that cantina in Bolivia with their guns firing and supposedly that being the end of their lives there. There's a lot of stories about how they actually did die. But the film leaves it pretty obvious that they died there in Bolivia. But that it's an iconic image that hung on my wall all the way until I left on my mission and left my home. It was something really special to me. And I've been able to, I don't know where that poster ended up, but a few years ago, I was able to purchase a poster at a fundraising auction. It wasn't the same Butch Cassidy poster, but it was one of those iconic Butch Cassidy posters, and it's signed by both Paul Newman and Robert Redford. And so I still have something special from those memories in my possession. A lot of times I think, well, gosh, if I ever get to go to Antiques Roadshow or if I get to go to whatever the pawn shop is in Las Vegas for Pawn Stars, I'm going to take that in and find out how much it's worth. In the meantime, I want to jump back and share with you what we did when we started St. George Magazine. Our first issue was in the spring of 1983. And then in 84, we began to produce the magazine on a regular basis. And the next edition, the second edition we did, we had a major section on movie filming in St. George. And we ended up in that issue with a photo of Robert Redford on the cover of the magazine. And that photo comes from the filming of The Electric Horseman, which occurred in the late 70s in St. George. But we had a lot of opportunity to talk to a lot of folks who had been involved with the movie industry in St. George in the 1940s and 50s. And most of those people are gone now. I would love to have them here as guests for this episode. But what I'll do here is share a few things with you from that issue, and we can maybe try to capture the spirit of that. If you go back, you realize that Kanab is where that really was Little Hollywood. And Kanab was where movie filming really reached a high degree of success during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the Perry brothers were responsible for bringing all of that together for Kanab back in those days. And you also had the movie filming occurring in Monument Valley, especially in the 40s with the legendary director John Ford, who came to Monument Valley and filmed a number of epic westerns there, including one called She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. And I want to share a little bit about that at some point here before we're done. So all of that was happening in Monument Valley in southeastern Utah, in Kanab, which is 80 miles east of St. George. But St. George really didn't put itself forward as a movie filming location in the same way. And yet by the 40s, and especially the 1950s, directors and location scouts had really began to set their sights here. I want to share some paragraphs from the article that I wrote in 1984 about the filming of The Conqueror in 1956 in St. George. Early in 1956, John Wayne toured Europe to promote his new movie, The Conqueror. His job was to attend premieres in places like London, Paris, Rome, and Berlin, and get people interested in going to the movie. He learned quickly, though, that his greatest task was not getting people to the theater, but convincing them that the wild and colorful scenery in the film was real, not fake. The Conqueror was shot near St. George. Some people just don't believe those fascinating multicolored cliffs and sands exist, John Wayne wrote back to the producers at RKO Pictures. I assure them they do. I also tell audiences some of the experiences we had while making The Conqueror in St. George and of the hospitality of the Utahns. I'm doing more than just selling this movie, Wayne wrote. I believe the St. George Chamber of Commerce should put me on its payroll. The Conqueror was not the movie industry's first contact with southern Utah. They'd been filming westerns in the Kanab area, 80 miles east of St. George, since Deadwood Coach in 1924, and Kanab had already been dubbed Little Hollywood. Further east, in Monument Valley, the great John Ford had filmed his classic Stagecoach in 1938, and other legendary titles like Fort Apache, My Darling Clementine, The Searchers, How the West Was Won, and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. But it was The Conqueror, the $6 million extravaganza about the Mongol leader Genghis Khan, who overran nearly half the world in the 13th century, that initiated St. George to the excitement, glamour, and money movies can bring. Men like Brown Hale, Dick Hammer, Andy Pace, Doyle Sampson, Mayor J. Clinton Snow, Mayor William Barlocker, A.L. Elmer, and Art Anderson were instrumental in fomenting the movie industry's love affair with Washington County. And since the mid-1950s, dozens of production companies have come to the area to take advantage of not only the scenery, but the services and hospitality as well. So that film in the mid-1950s was a pretty amazing undertaking when you consider that there were as many as 1,000 horses and 1,000 riders involved in scenes of that movie, and they were shot in Snow Canyon, they were shot out at Harrisburg, and the scenery in that movie is just unbelievable. And of course, John Wayne is the star. He's the biggest name of the times. And I guess the sad thing about it, even though the movie was a success at the box office and it did make money, it's now pretty much forgotten. It almost became, I'm not sure how to describe it, but over the years as people watched it, they realized how silly it was with John Wayne trying to play Genghis Khan and the lines that he had to recite on that film. And there was something about it that just didn't quite work. But the scenery is there. And it may not be a very watchable film based on the script and the dialogue, but it is a very watchable film based on the scenery itself, and it's pretty amazing. I want to share with you, I'll read a little sidebar that was in that piece in the St. George magazine regarding the Conqueror. It's called Conquering Unemployment in St. George. When director Dick Powell brought John Wayne and Susan Hayward to town to shoot The Conqueror, there was not an unemployed worker in St. George. In fact, they had to go to Cedar City to get some more help. Close to 1,000 men, as many horses, and 250 studio craftsmen were used during those hot summer months of 1954, and they shot some of what, up to that time, were the biggest battle scenes in movie history, to depict the clash of 13th century Mongols and Tartars. Virtually all of Hollywood's stuntmen, nearly the entire Shivwits Indian Band, and most anyone who could ride a horse was summoned to the set at Harrisburg Junction, 12 miles northeast of St. George. A tent city housing more than 1,200 costumes, weapons, and armor was erected, along with dressing rooms, corrals for livestock, and roads for access. St. George Boy Scouts lent enough tables and chairs to serve 800 lunches at a time. The school board allowed for the use of 9 buses, and arrangements were made with local restaurants for RKO employees to sign for meals. National writers representing newspapers and magazines with combined circulation of more than 22 million were on hand as 3 CinemaScope camera crews focused in on the action and the vivid, colorful backdrops. Everything was perfect, but for one thing. It was July, and it was pushing 120 degrees. In spite of the heat, the show went on, and when it was over, Washington County was $750,000 richer and in love with the movie industry. Several locals got a heavy dose of movie production, both in front of and behind the camera. Coach Walt Brooks of Dixie High School was a stand-in for John Wayne. Jane Wadsworth stood in for Susan Hayward and had a bit part in the movie. Even Ez MacArthur closed his barber shop on several occasions to work as an extra. Andy Pace, Lee Esplin, Rudger Atkin, Earl Rollins, Vernon Worthen, Doyle Sampson, Brown Hale, and many others got in on the act. Amazingly enough, the entire extravaganza was completed without a major incident, except for a sty in John Wayne's left eye caused by the glare and dust, which for 2 days confined his close-ups to the right side of his face, and a fall from a horse suffered by the Mexican actor Armendariz, whom Dr. A.W. McGregor treated and listed injuries as badly sprained back, 5 loose teeth, and flesh torn from a badly swollen jaw. Even with all this, the RKO people found time to stage a benefit softball game with the local Elks to pay off the deficit on the athletic field. Here's how the County News reported the game. Susan Hayward kicked off her high heels, got a hit, and stole bases in her stocking feet. John Wayne, Dick Powell, and other famous people played ball and put on a show which any community in the U.S., regardless of size, might well envy. In the book When Hollywood Came to Town by James DeArc, there's a wonderful few paragraphs about the Conqueror that I wanted to share with you. James DeArc's book, When Hollywood Came to Town, A History of Movie Making, is published by Gibb Smith, and it's an amazing chronicle of an amazing document of movie filming in Utah, and it zeroes in on all the different parts of Utah, including St. George. And the story of the Conqueror is a big part of that. Let me just share some lines from his book. By the time the final production units left St. George for Hollywood on August 4th, it was estimated that RKO had poured $750,000 into the St. George economy, not counting the tourist trade attracted by more than 20 representatives of the press who had traveled to St. George to cover the making of the Conqueror for dozens of publications, including Life, Cosmopolitan, and the New York Times. The frenetic business in stores and restaurants subsided to normal levels. There's a sort of lonesome feeling around the streets, like your home is for a time after a house guest has said the last goodbye and departed, wrote Nora Lyman in the Washington County News. This was our first visit by a major picture company, and I'm sure we are unintentionally guilty of many sins of omission and commission. But as a whole community, it was our greatest desire to be helpful when needed and out of the way at all other times. We sincerely hope they will come back to mingle with us. Praise came from the departing celebrities. You have 2 wonderful crops in St. George, said Dick Powell, hospitality and healthy, happy, well-mannered children. Pedro Armendariz called St. George a wonderful community of very considerate people. Location manager Harold Lewis confessed that the hills and valleys surrounding St. George were a tough location, but it would have been a lot tougher if the people here hadn't been so helpful. From the Duke came the same expansive statement, the Duke being John Wayne. This is the way we like to think of America, people cheerfully helping people simply because that's a good way to live. Reviews by the major trade press were largely positive, praising Powell's vigorous direction and the raw beauty of the outdoor locations in Utah that had scope and splendor. The rest of the press was not so generous. The Conqueror turned out to be a hit with audiences, earning nearly $12 million in its theatrical release, in a year that included The King and I, Guys and Dolls, and Moby Dick. The Conqueror fared very well at the box office. It was number 11 in revenue, comparable with Rebel Without a Cause, and out-earning The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, Bus Stop, and even Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. Wayne's depiction of Genghis Khan, in the context of his many westerns, took on comic aspects that were the object of derision. The film had originally been written for Marlon Brando, whose thespian talents might have made the vintage dialogue palatable. However, by the time Wayne saw the script and objected to the dialogue as unbelievable, it was too late to rewrite his lines. In 1980, a book cited The Conqueror as one of the golden turkeys of all time. So there you have it, a movie that had a huge impact on St. George while they were here, perhaps the most monumental movie ever filmed within the close location of St. George, and really one of the movies with the most amazing scenery you could ever imagine, scenery that John Wayne said people in Europe thought was fake. All of that was great, but at the same time, it ended up being one of the golden turkeys of all time. The other aspect of The Conqueror is the aftermath from it, and I'm not going to go into that too much here, but I'm sure that anyone who knows something about that history would wonder why I didn't if I didn't. And that is the fact that many of the folks who were here among the cast, the crew, and others during that time, which happened to be during the time of the downwind atomic testing in Nevada, many of those folks later died of cancer, and there was a lot of questioning about whether or not their time here, being involved so close to the ground around St. George, might have had something to do with that. According to what James DeArc writes here, 90 of the 220 crew members contracted cancer, according to a People magazine study, of which 46 died from the disease, including John Wayne, Agnes Moorehead, Susan Hayward, and Dick Powell. Top-level congressional hearings were conducted throughout the 1980s, a bipartisan effort by Utah Congressman Wayne Owens and Senator Orrin Hatch resulted in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, signed into law by President George H.W. Bush in 1990. The act provided payments to those cancer victims who were exposed to the atomic testing, as well as to uranium miners. Inasmuch as many of the victims who worked on the Conqueror were heavy cigarette smokers, the question remained as to what was the primary contributor to their deaths. Wayne's son Michael said the theory that his father's death was due to radiation exposure on the Conqueror doesn't hold much water. Quote, "I don't put much credence in the story. Bill Conrad was in the film, Norman Powell, and a lot of other people were out there, but none of us have cancer." Even restaurant owner and location caterer Dick Hammer weighed in on the controversy. "We were there more than anyone else," said Hammer, whose crew of 55 served hundreds of meals daily at his restaurant, and out on location without any of them contracting cancer. Nevertheless, the Conqueror, often referred to as an RKO radioactive picture, will forever be linked with this intense period of atomic testing. So there are so many stories tied to all of these things, and yet the memories of folks, many of whom are no longer with us, especially from that period, were really special. And when we did this article in 1984, we talked to a lot of people like Cuba Lyle, who had the old Liberty Cafe on the boulevard, and her interaction with all those movie stars as she fed them and as they came into the restaurant there. The same with Dick Hammer and Dick's Cafe on St. George Boulevard. And his cafe, his restaurant, actually came onto screen with the filming of The Electric Horseman. And actually the final scene with Robert Redford and Jane Fonda is in Dick's Cafe right there on St. George Boulevard. Dear friend and neighbor Billy Fry, who's no longer with us, she was a waitress at Dick's Cafe during that time and has fond memories of Robert Redford, Jane Fonda, all of those people coming in to the cafe and interacting with the local folks. There's the legendary story. Willie Nelson appears in The Electric Horseman, and there was a very small group of people who had the amazing opportunity to be at the 101 Club in Virgin, up midway between Hurricane and Springdale. Apparently, Willie and some of his friends went up there on at least one occasion, and probably more, after filming and jammed in the bar there at the 101 Club in Virgin. And the people who happened to be there that night had an amazing experience in the presence of Willie Nelson, who was singing and playing and just doing what he does naturally, doing what people pay hundreds of dollars to get a ticket for in large venues. But some of our folks got to see him right there in the 101 Club that night. I'm looking at this promotional poster for The Conqueror. Howard Hughes presents John Wayne, Susan Hayward in The Conqueror. Under his heel, cowering nations. In his arms, an untamed woman. Spectacular as its barbaric passions and savage conquests, 2 years in the making at a cost of $6 million. And then turn the page in James DeArc's book, and there's a picture of John Wayne dressed up like Genghis Khan. Somehow he doesn't quite work as Genghis Khan. And director Dick Powell, John Wayne with a long cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and Dick Powell with one between his fingers of his right hand. And you're thinking about, okay, how much tobacco and nicotine was consumed in Snow Canyon during that time, and how much atomic fallout was in the sand there as well. It's just all in that photograph. But the sad part of it is that most of them did, not many years later, die of cancer. I think that it's awesome to maybe look at some of the movies, not in detail, but just mention some of the movies that were filmed after The Conqueror. The Vanished Americans, The King and Four Queens in 1956, The Run of the Arrow in 1957. These are all Westerns that take really great advantage of the amazing landscape here. But then we come to a film called They Came to Cordura, filmed in 1959. And that's a film that most people maybe haven't heard of, or many people haven't seen, and yet it is a film that stands up with time and really captures beautifully the landscape around St. George. It was filmed in Snow Canyon. It was filmed at Harrisburg, many of the same locations as The Conqueror. But this film was, you'd have to say, better written and maybe better produced, better cast in a sense. And the star was Gary Cooper, along with Rita Hayworth, Van Heflin. Tab Hunter was the teen heartthrob of those days, and very well known to people who, not my generation, but the generation before mine. The thing about They Came to Cordura is, number one, that it's a great film, but number two, there's some wonderful stories that come with it. And one of those stories is a story that I grew up with because I lived next door to one of the principal characters in that story. And I want to share that with you now. Most of the folks who grew up in St. George or in the Utah's Dixie area in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s have stories to tell about the movies and about movie stars coming to town. There's just so many awesome memories that people have. I wish we could have everyone here to tell those stories. What I'm going to do right now is share with you one of my stories. It's a secondhand experience. I was told this by Jack E. Holt. He was my friend Kenny Holt's father, my next door neighbor on 600 South growing up in the 1960s, late 50s and 60s in St. George. Jack owned the Twin Oaks Motel. He was an entrepreneur in town, but he, more than anything, was a hunter. He loved to hunt, and there was nothing he loved more than to hunt geese. And in 1959, I would have been 4 years old. Jack was hunting geese down on the Virgin River with a man named Tank Thompson, another legend of St. George. And they harvested 2 or 3, maybe 4 geese that morning. And Tank was driving an old Oldsmobile. It was probably new Oldsmobile at that time. This would have been in 1959. And they put the geese in the trunk of the car and decided to go visit the movie set where a movie called They Came to Cordura was being filmed at that time. A movie that starred the legendary Gary Cooper. And when I say legendary, Gary Cooper would be among probably the top 5 legends of Hollywood, and especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was the Tom Cruise of that era, or maybe Tom Cruise times 10. Gary Cooper, what an amazing career he had. He was filming this movie, They Came to Cordura. I'm not sure where the set was on the day that Jack and Tank went to visit. But they drove up to the set, and I don't know, it would take a lot of chutzpah to do that, but they drove up to the set, and they wanted to check out and see what was going on there. And there were some people there that they started to talk to, and so they wanted to show them the geese that they had gotten that morning. And when they opened the trunk, there must have been at least one of those birds that was still alive, and it began to squawk. And it made what Jack said was the most, well, I'll just say what he said, the most ungodly sound you can imagine. And it went all across the movie set. And within seconds, Gary Cooper was right there at the trunk of the car with Jack and Tank, and he looking at those geese, and he said, "Where did you get those?" And Jack said, "We just got them this morning down on the Virgin River." And he said, "Can I go hunting with you guys?" And he got permission from the director to leave the set, and they went hunting down on the Virgin River. And the next day, they showed up again, and Gary Cooper was able to arrange to go hunting with them. What Jack said is what they realized a few days later, because they did this for several days, is that the director was actually really happy to have them come and get him and go hunting, because the director said that Gary Cooper had never been better prepared with his lines and in a better mood to work with than he was those days when he knew he was going goose hunting. And so the director actually encouraged Jack to take him hunting, which they did. And it was an amazing experience for a St. George guy to become a close friend with one of the most iconic actors in Hollywood. But that's not the end of the story. What happened is Gary would come back and hunt. Well, Jack called him Coop. Coop would come back and hunt. And that first happened in 59. It was in the spring of 61 that Jack Holt got a call at his house in St. George. And he lifted up the phone, and the voice said, "Jack, this is Coop. I'm in room 14 at the Twin Oaks." And he said, "Come on up." So Jack went from his house and drove up to his motel on St. George Boulevard. He saw Gary Cooper's car there. He drove a Plymouth Fury, and it had custom Ferrari seats in it because he'd had a leg injury earlier in his life, and these seats made it more comfortable for him. But he had driven up from Hollywood. He had a room at Jack's motel, and he wanted to talk to Jack. And Jack stepped into the room, and Gary Cooper unbuttoned his shirt and showed Jack the scars on his chest or on his abdomen. And he said, "Jack, the doctors have opened me up, and I'm full of cancer, and they give me a very short time to live." He said, "I want to go goose hunting. Let's go hunting." And Jack said that they hunted for several days. This would have been in early 1961. And during this period, Gary Cooper also went to Sun Valley, Idaho, and tromped through the snow with his old friend Ernest Hemingway, and they hunted together as well. So I was 6 years old. My neighbor was taking off hunting with Gary Cooper every day, and that was some of his final days. I believe he died in the summer of 1961. I could be wrong on that, but it wasn't that much later. But what I always remembered is how Jack told that story and how earnest he was in just sharing the fact that Cooper, in his understated way, in the same way that he acted in his roles, he basically, in so many words, said, "I'm dying," and he said, "Let's go hunting." As I shared earlier, the filming of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was something really monumental here. And it's interesting to look back now and see how that all came about. When we were producing this edition of St. George Magazine in 1984, we were really interested in potentially visiting with Robert Redford. We didn't know what the reality of that might be, but we thought, oh my goodness, wouldn't it be great to talk to him about his experience here, about the filming of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and why it is that they did it here. And also, there was a lot of talk going around at that time about how much Robert Redford loved this area and his thoughts about potentially building a studio here. He was working with Brooks Pace, who owned the property, which has now become Entrada and the Black Desert Resort and all of that area. Redford was really focused on that property in the early and mid-1980s and looking at potentially building a studio there. And it's interesting how that harkens forward to where we are now with Kevin Costner working with local landowners and developers to actually bring to fruition what Robert Redford was thinking about and talking about a generation or more than a generation ago. But like I say, when I was younger, the whole aura of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was amazing. It's always been one of my, well, it probably is my top favorite movie for a lot of reasons, but more than anything because it showcases my backyard, our backyard, in an amazing and beautiful and wonderful way. And it does so with a really great story, with really great actors, and a wonderful script, and a truly memorable and powerful movie. And all of that came together. I think it was released in 1969. I mentioned 1968 earlier. I think that's when they were probably filming it. But the movie really did have an impact. And once we saw it, it was just so great to run up to Grafton and look at the set there because it's a natural movie set with the old one-room school and church. They did build a special house, kitty corner from the church, just for the movie, but everything else was just natural there. And I remember when I was maybe 14, 15 years old, running up there with friends. And we actually got up into the hayloft where Catherine Ross was sitting in that iconic scene where she's watching Paul Newman ride the bike and showing off for her on the bike with that Burt Bacharach music, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. Some of that seems a little hokey now, but it was just amazing to be in the very spot where she was. And it was an old original Pioneer barn. And you could look out that loft down at the pathway where Paul Newman rode that bike. Those were the kind of things that were really memorable for us and really connected us to the whole aura of Robert Redford. And then he came back again he came back to film Jeremiah Johnson in 1972. Much of it was filmed in northern Utah or in and around what is now his Sundance Resort. But a lot of the scenes were done here in southern Utah, and especially out on the Ivans Bench, the old Ivans Reservoir, and the Kayenta Cliffs there. And those scenes are iconic. And I was a junior in high school at that time, and I remember interacting with some of their location people who needed livestock and who were trying to connect all the resources that were available. But Jeremiah Johnson is a movie that still stands up and is still really admired and appreciated. And then there were, The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing. That was 1973. The Eiger Sanction. There were scenes from the Eiger Sanction, which is set mainly in Europe, but there were scenes that were shot here in St. George. And then one that you really got to see, The Car, 1977. It's the hokiest movie that you'll ever watch, but it will share with you St. George in 1977. And it's just awesome to watch, even though it's maybe one of the worst movies ever made. And I'm not going to go any further into that except to tell you that it's the car, and there was nobody driving the car. It drove itself. But then we come to The Electric Horseman in 1979, and in a lot of ways, that's the film that really connected Redford and St. George, because the film was written for him and with the idea that it would be filmed here. And St. George actually is part of the film. And the fun thing about that, I'm looking at James D'Arc's book right now, the horse that is the key animal character in the film, my cousin's horse had the markings and the coloring very similar to that horse, was the stand-in horse for the Electric Horseman. And that's just one more example of the kind of stories that so many people have about when they're watching these films, they can say, yeah, that's my horse. But Electric Horseman was a lot of fun. It's not the greatest movie ever made, but it is a good movie, and it still stands up nicely. So here we were in 1984, reaching out to Robert Redford. He had filmed The Electric Horseman here 5 years earlier, and we wanted to talk to him about his feelings about St. George and about his thoughts of the future for St. George. And we reached out to his folks, and one day I'm in my little St. George magazine office in 1984, and the phone rings, and it says, "Is that you, Lyman?" And I said, "Yes." And the voice on the other end said, "This is Bob Redford." And he called back, and we were able to talk for 25 minutes. And it was an amazing experience, especially for me as a budding journalist, and the chance to talk to an already legendary actor, but especially to talk to him very intimately about St. George and what it means to him. And so the other day I was rustling through my materials in my office, I came across the cassette tape of my interview with Robert Redford. And I brought it to Ricky, and we were able to work through it. And so I'm just going to share that with you now.
Since 1968, when I had persuaded them to film part of Butch Cassidy there, they were initially going to film it in New Mexico. And they wanted to film the entire portion, southwestern portion, in New Mexico. And I had persuaded the director to come to see St. George. I've been going to St. George since the very early 60s and have always liked it. I've been driving through there since the 50s. And I'd always liked the area very much and been drawn to it and saw it as a great potential for filmmaking. So I got them to look it over, and they liked it. We, of course, filmed there. And that started just a lot of activity, at least in terms of my films. The next one was Jeremiah Johnson. I got that one down there. And I just decided right around 1970 that whenever I could, I would try anything of a Western nature, I would try to bring to St. George or in that area, because to me it had all the variety, it had the ideal conditions for location filming. Namely, it had a lot of variety in mountains, deserts, and red rock canyon country. It had clear vistas which enable you to film without the pollution, the kind of industrial pollution, which makes filming in the West very, very hard, because when you're doing period pieces, you can't have industrial haze because it belies the time era. So it had that, and it had what I thought was spectacular scenery that had never really been exposed before, except in all the pictures in Kanab. So Jeremiah Johnson was the other one. And then I made a promotional film for the state of Utah in 1970, which they never used because it was a little bit ahead of its time with that particular administration. At that time, they were just still looking at the sellable points of Utah being Promontory Point, Mormon Tabernacle, and the Great Salt Lake. I said, I'll do this film for you. They'd asked me to make it for them, a half-hour promotional film. I said, I'll do it, but I would like to update it and show other aspects of Utah that I think would be attractive. And so I made that film, and I did a lot of stuff around St. George. But they never used it because I think they were afraid that it didn't show the Tabernacle or the all the standard stuff, the old Union Pacific film made in the 40s. So I don't know whatever happened to that, but that was the other piece of filming I did down there, and that spent a lot of time focusing on the St. George area as an attractive place to come. At the time, I think the reason the state, I think that's probably changed now, by the way, but 14 years ago, the state felt that showing space was a detriment. They wanted to show industrial action like the Thiokol plant or Geneva Steel or Kennecott Copper, and I said, well, I did not think that would attract outsiders. What I thought would attract outsiders was to show the incredible space and beauty of the place that would bring people there, and they just viewed it differently. They thought it showed the state to be barren. I think probably 14 years later that would be thought of differently. But at any rate, I decided that sort of was a waste of my time, and I just went on to pass the word on about St. George, and then decided that I would just bring my own films there, and that alone would probably be something of a promotional aspect. So then the next was the Electric Horseman, which of course was a major promotion for St. George in the area, and that literally was created around that. That was a script that we developed ourselves from scratch and just made it around the St. George area. And now after that time, I've been involved here recently in an effort to try to set up a studio there for filming, and I've been talking to Brooks Pace. And so I'm really not comfortable talking too much about it until it's firmed up, but the idea is I would like to see a soundstage built there where you could attract television and film location people on a pretty regular basis, which would be good for St. George commerce. It would be very good for the tax base, and also it's non-threatening on both fronts. You know, the people of St. George are very friendly, and it's a good community for film people to associate with, and for the local merchants. Film people spend quite a bit of money. So I saw that as a real advantage, and that's sort of where that pretty well says it all. This has been brewing for almost 15 years, come to fruition in the last few years, kind of a dream to develop in a more solid way a base for filming in that area.
When someone says St. George, what images are conjured in your mind? What do you feel for St. George when you hear those words? Well,
of course, my fondness for St. George almost approaches the sacred to a sacred degree, so the word saint really kind of fits. I see incredible variety and space, and I feel something really quite spiritually prehistoric about the place. I think one of the reasons I, in the past, have been concerned about industry coming in there when they were planning the big power plant. Not that a power plant is wrong, it's where it's going that's important. And I was concerned that something so incredible that if maintained, at least in part, through years, would end up being a great virtue that would be pretty well savaged by the wrong kind of development. And I really saw the potential for St. George to retain its greatest asset, which is its community sense and the land around it, by attracting a certain kind of industry and not another. So I obviously see St. George as a wonderful piece of nature where people can also live. Now, that's not always possible, to have the feeling of a national park where you can also live as a community and have an industry that will support that. I was concerned that the rush to just get money in quickly would bring the wrong kind of industry that would, once it was in, that would be it. That would be the end of the game. And St. George would lose its tremendous potential to grow through the years to a place where it could be attracted all over, to people all over. When you say St. George, I think of a wonderful God-developed, the best developer, St. George, has been God himself and nature. So that's the way I feel about it.
How do you feel at the present time? I don't know if you're real aware of what's going on here, but do you feel like St. George is moving in a good direction
now?
Yes,
I do. For the first time in many years, I was concerned for many, many years that it could have gone several different directions in the past 15 years, and I spent probably 12 of those 15 years being real concerned which way it was going to go. But I have real positive feelings now that there's some good people in that community that have a hold of, that have the ability to preserve what's good about St. George and keep some integrity, keep the integrity that was there on the land with the development of the community. I feel very positive.
Now, obviously, with your desire to build a studio here, you would plan on doing more filming in this area in the future.
Well, I would do that in any case, Lyman. I love the area so much. As long as it's there, of course, if it ceases to be there by overdevelopment, then you can't film. I suspect that won't happen. I think it'll always, or at least for a long time to come, be an ideal spot to come film. So I would do that in any case. I kind of made that pledge to myself years ago that whenever I had the opportunity at all, I would bring my films to St. George.
Mr. Renford, you've traveled the world and you've seen everything. You've already told me your feelings of St. George, but is St. George really that unique?
It is. To me, Lyman, I don't know about somebody else. We're all speaking personally here. I just returned from Africa, and I went to this place that is much talked about worldwide as being significant in terms of its physical beauty and its sense of history, and it couldn't hold a candle to what I feel about St. George and the feeling if I stand in one spot, St. George area, and I look around, and I stood in a spot in Africa that was supposed to be an incredible spot. It was beautiful, but it didn't come close. So the same with Nepal and other places I've been that are quite beautiful. But to me, I don't know of many places that are more beautiful than certain spots around St. George. I just have a particular fondness for it.
I wondered also if you would like to tell us a little bit about your present project.
It's called The Natural, and it's from a novel by Bernard Malamud about a baseball player in the 1920s, and it will be coming out in May. I get to play my own baseball in it, which is nice. I used to play baseball.
That's great.
So I'm enjoying it.
So there you have it, an interview with Robert Redford 41 years ago. I love how that ends. I know that it ended abruptly on the tape. We talked a little bit longer, but what you heard there, when I asked him what he was working on, he shared that they were right in the middle of editing The Natural. And I had forgotten about him sharing that. That was all those years ago. And here we are 40 years later, and The Natural is one of my top 5 favorite movies. Little did I know at the time what it even was. I was visiting with Robert Redford while he was completing that film. And I might as well just level with you my favorite films: Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Chariots of Fire, The Natural, Field of Dreams. So that brings that full circle. Robert Redford, Kevin Costner. And then there's two Irish films that are among my all-time favorites. One is Into the West, and the other is Waking Ned Devine. That's the way I'll end this. Of my top favorite films, one of them is the most iconic film ever done in the St. George area. And three of them have either Robert Redford or Kevin Costner in them.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George area Zag stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home.